Good morning, good good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're meeting us from. My name is John Conley. I'm director of the Institute for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our meeting with Pieter Judson from the European Institute in Florence. I'm going to say a few words before Pieter starts. Pieter received his bachelor's degree at Swarthmore College and then his doctorate from Columbia University with East Van Dyck. He then taught at Swarthmore College until 2014, and since that point, he's been teaching at the European University Institute, where he's a professor for 19th and 20th century history. He's produced three important award-winning monographs, beginning with Exclusive Revolutionaries in 1997. That's about liberal politics, social experience, and national identity in the Austrian Empire, 1848 to 1914, which won the most prestigious award of the AHA for a first book in European history. That's the Herbert Baxter Adams Prize. His second book was Guardians of the Nation in 2010, Activists on the Language Frontiers of Imperial Austria, which won the most prestigious award of the largest professional association dealing with East Central Europe and the Slavic world in general. That's the Barbara Yelovich Prize, as well as several other prizes. And most recently, Pieter has written The Habsburg Empire, A New History, came out with Harvard in 2016, which was a Choice Outstanding Academic Title of 2016. This book, landmark book on the Habsburg Empire, has been celebrated in a range of popular and academic publications. And I'll just pick out one accolade. Natasha Wheatley of Princeton wrote in the London Review of Books that Habsburg history is not the same after this book. What more could we hope for our academic work than such a statement? There's much more that I could say about Pieter's accomplishments and activities, but I'll finish with one personal anecdote, which is that I can't tell how many times over the years, I've encountered a promising candidate in European history and noticed that they have some relation to Swarthmore College. Happens again and again. And in all of these cases, I determined that it was Pieter who had turned this person onto history. And in the last few years, I've increasingly noticed among interesting work coming out in European history that people are associated with the European University Institute. Including a review of my own book that just arrived in my inbox yesterday, which I'm very eager to read. So without further ado, I want to welcome you to our talk, and Pieter will address us on remembering empire for a different history of Habsburg Central Europe. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, John. And thank you especially for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I also want to say good morning, good afternoon, and as you can see here, good evening to the people who are listening. The Habsburg monarchy, or empire, plays several roles in European histories, but it rarely plays the main role. In a world where nationally segregated professions organize popular and professional histories into separate narratives, the empire of the Habsburgs remains a perennial outsider. In this, it differs from other European empires, such as the British, Dutch, French, German, Italian, Russian, or Spanish, just to name a few. They remain key players in the histories of the states that still bear their names in the 21st century. They have national foundations, centrally organized archives, and plenty of popular literature that connects to old imperial ambitions to contemporary nationalist identifications. So too does the Ottoman Empire in modern Turkey. Research and writing on the Habsburg monarchy, by contrast, is not generally supported financially by any state today, although the Austrian and Hungarian governments do fund Habsburg-related projects. This observation also strikes me when I visit the excellent, if controversial, House of Austrian History in Vienna, the Haus der Österreichischen Geschichte. Where's the empire? Of course, the organizers were given ludicrously cramped quarters and minimal funds to realize this important project. But this observation had already struck me 15 years earlier when I set out to write a history of the empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. At the time, I naively believed a relatively simple task. I'd gather together some secondary literature on the empire and update the traditional narratives, a task that had not seriously been attempted for several decades. It was important because the field of modern Habsburg history, as opposed to the early modern, had generated so much innovative work since the 1980s. Yet the ideas that informed that work had hardly influenced the general histories at all. And this was even more the case when it came to the place of the Habsburg Empire in general histories of Europe. Many, although not all, of those older narratives framed the empire as an anachronism in 19th and 20th century Europe, as a failed state and as a site of irreconcilable nationalist conflict. Those narratives of failure and conflict had even gained renewed explanatory power during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. But they so often contradicted what the local and regional studies were telling us. I also wanted to find a way to compare those elements of Habsburg crisis, conflict, or failure to what I believed were similar phenomena that had plagued other European states. To take an extreme example, does anyone today remember George Dangerfield's History of Britain in the years leading up to the First World War, The Strange Death of Liberal England? That book offered an account of the Irish labor and feminist crises, arguing that the pre-war British governments had no answer for them. Yet no one would call the UK or the British Empire a failed state in 1914, would they? Still, as I like to remind people, it was Dublin, not in Habsburg Central Europe, where the worst, really the only nationalist rebellion took place during the First World War. And what about labor unrest in France or political unrest in Spain, Portugal, and Italy? I won't even mention Russia. The point is that much of what we consider to be uniquely Austro-Hungarian may be better explained as crises of social mobilization faced by all European states in the last third of the 19th century and the opening decade of the 20th. In 2005, I also wondered why narratives of failure, conflict, and decline remain so powerful when local, regional, institutional, economic, cultural studies since the 1980s featured dynamism, growth, invention, and innovation. Why was it, for example, that in the 1980s, Habsburg towns and cities were celebrated as centers of cultural, artistic, and scientific innovation? Remember all those Vienna 1900, Budapest 1900 museum exhibitions? While the empire remained a doomed failure. Did it count for nothing that the Austrian Lloyd or Lloyd Austriaco in Trieste had dominated commerce, trade, and transport in the Eastern Mediterranean? Or that one could board a train in Lviv in 1910 and arrive in Vienna almost 4 hours faster than is the case today? Or that close to 400,000 migrants to the Americas from Austria-Hungary had returned to the empire by 1910? Back in 2005, I wanted to integrate those local and regional histories into a larger narrative. But to do that, I had to make the empire itself the central element of the history I told. And I wanted to do it without relying on a misplaced nostalgia for empire, of which there seems to be plenty these days. The serious challenge we all face is that precisely the stories about failure and conflict also serve as foundational elements of separate national histories even today. For these histories, the empire functions as a negative, fundamentally alien force in the life of national communities. That alien power and authority had to be overcome in order to establish the independent states that replaced it. According to this narrative, national communities finally accomplished their historic task at the end of the First World War, when Austria-Hungary collapsed and successor states that called themselves national took its territory. What is lost in a history that frames empire as an alien authority, I wonder? What is lost in the unwillingness or the lack of concern to integrate an imperial past into a national present? Who gets written out of these histories? And here I'm thinking specifically about Islam in Europe, but it's not the only example. And why should all this remain a conundrum over a century later in 2021? Surely by now we are not so invested in nationalist narratives, so fearful of questioning them, that we can begin finally to integrate the history of empire into the histories of the states that replaced it. But maybe that anxious investment remains, and stronger than I'd like to think. These questions arose again for me in 2018, when the several successor states celebrated the centennial of their existences, or of their territorial expansions. These celebrations apparently reviving precisely those heroic foundational myths of national emancipation from 1918. National existence still seemed to require the rejection of an imperial past. But that wasn't the whole story in 2018 either. At the very same time, a spate of nationally and internationally funded projects confirmed again, only in rather new and exciting ways, what many historians have known for a long time, that a series of influential continuities, institutional, administrative, legal, and cultural, linked the rejected empire quite closely in character to the successor states. I'd like to name two of these ERC-funded projects: Gabor Egri's Nepostrans, Negotiating Post-Imperial Transitions, and Michal Frankel's Unlikely Refuge, Refugees and Citizens in 20th Century East Central Europe. Egri's team is researching not only continuities and breaks at the local and regional levels between empire and successor states, but also seeking, and I think this is really important, seeking to recapture the experience of local societies during the turbulent period after the breakup of the Habsburg monarchy. His results so far have been remarkable, often surprising, and always impressive, and I urge you to visit his website. But the issue for me is not simply the crucial question of continuities between empire and successor states, it's what we do with that knowledge. In the rest of my talk, I'll propose some ways to view the historically contentious relationship between nationhood and empire in more intimate and less binary terms, as a way of possibly integrating them into a different narrative. I argue that what is often viewed as a relationship between historically opposed forces might rather be seen as two mutually constitutive forces in Habsburg Central Europe. It's not that each defined itself by responding to the claims or the attacks of the other. I believe that each created conditions wherein the other prospered. Ultimately, each enriched the other, socially, culturally, economically, and politically. Empire was hardly an alien force to be overcome because those who abandoned it in 1918 often had played a key role in building it. Up until its collapse, this empire was an ongoing project, one that took place as much in the village square as it did in the halls of government of Budapest and Vienna. It did not consist simply of institutions imposed from above. Empire was not a unified or a planned project, even if the Habsburgs would have liked to have thought of it that way. It was a diverse set of projects engaged in by people at different levels of society and administration who pursued the interests, as they saw them, of their village, town, region, or social group. If we recognize and understand this more fully, we may find effective ways to integrate empire more fully into the histories of the successor states. But first, in order to understand how empire became alienated from nation in 1918, I need to talk a bit about that word democracy and its meanings after the First World War. How and why did empire become associated with oppressive authoritarianism and nation state with democracy? Okay, democracy. 1918 was not a good year for the international reputation of empire. After the Bolshevik Revolution, both Leninist and Wilsonist rhetoric sought to align national communities with the revolutionary principles of democracy, while characterizing empires as authoritarian prisons of the people. Of course, these were propagandistic claims, although one could say that the military dictatorship of the First World War certainly looked a lot like an oppressive prison of the peoples. Anyway, during the Paris peace conferences, claims about the association of democracy and nationhood became a powerful legitimation for the successor states that hoped to control the region. The argument that saw nation statehood in terms of the will of the people did not escape the attention of activists outside Europe as well. They saw in this rhetoric a potential instrument to challenge the power of the victorious British, French, or American empires, among others, as well. Although these colonized voices were kept away from discussions in Paris, many of the negotiators from the successor states justified their claims based on the allegedly democratic character of the settlement. But the proof for their claim about embodying the will of the people lay more in their rejection of empire than in any conception of democracy rooted in the rights of individuals. Thomas Garrick Masaryk expressed this dichotomy between empire and nation when he wrote, still at the end of 1918, that, quote, "On the whole, great multinational empires are an institution of the past, of a time when material force had been held high and the principle of nationality had not been recognized because democracy had not been recognized. Multinational empires rested on the naked exercise of power by one group over many others. Now, however, the people would choose statehood organized around their shared nationality. Of course, choosing to organize a state this way neither ensured democratic practice, nor did it rule out the oppression of peoples, as examples from Italy to Romania to Subcarpathian Rus would soon demonstrate. But leaving aside the questionable democratic commitments of the successor states, we might ask, who were the subjects of this democratic moment? Who had chosen the nation-state form? In fact, it was the spokespeople for the national communities who were the actors in this democracy, not individual citizens. This conception of democracy that applied to peoples rather than to individuals explains how several blatantly undemocratic regimes nevertheless claimed the mantle of democracy. It was not even clear that most people in Central Europe cared one way or the other about nation statehood in 1918. Many did not even share similar understandings of what nationhood meant. Most sought some way out of the misery, starvation, disease, destruction, and violence that war and its aftermath imposed on them. The idea that political rights should be vested in national communities rather than in individuals had long been pursued by nationalist activists seeking to influence the political structures of the Habsburg monarchy. It was a direct product of their experience in empire. Okay, now, nation and empire. The empire of the Habsburgs was built on nations, but these were nations of a very different kind than those to which Masaryk, Lenin, or Wilson had referred. These nations were the privileged estates who had negotiated and renegotiated the terms of their region's belonging with a Habsburg sovereign. Different territories had maintained different laws, traditions, and political cultures. Their elites had referred to themselves as the nation. In the 19th century, of course, a very different understanding of nationhood had developed in Europe, one usually defined by common language use, by what was called a common culture, and sometimes by common religious practice, and always by the idea of a common shared history. During the same period, empire was also taking on some new meanings. So it's not just nation, but it's also empire that changes. Starting in 1804, the Habsburgs had proclaimed that their territories made up a single imperial state known as Austria. And this was when Napoleon was busy ending the Holy Roman Empire. The Empire of Austria now came to refer to a single unitary Habsburg state with common institutions, laws, practice, and citizenship. And there would be further new meanings attached to this idea of empire in the decades to come, thanks to the rise of nationalism. Here, I want to emphasize the view that concepts of nationhood, defined by language use or common culture, did not develop on their own, out of awakening nations, as 19th century nationalists like to claim. And as these more populist or universal concepts of nationhood did develop, they did not necessarily reject empire. In the 19th century, common imperial institutions created rhetorical and real political spaces that encouraged diverse nationalist activists to make political claims on the state. To see where empire shaped this new understanding of nationhood, you can examine the long traditions of linguistic practice in the Habsburgs' diverse territories and how that practice changed in the 19th century, or rather, not that it changed, but that it became understood in new ways. Habsburg pragmatism had encouraged the use of vernacular languages in local primary schools, or, for example, when decrees were made public, even under centralizing rulers like Joseph II. The Habsburgs didn't view linguistic diversity as a threat to the integrity of their state. During the Napoleonic Wars, for example, state propagandists devised patriotic appeals in several languages. With the rise of popular politics later in the 19th century, however, these pragmatic practices became reformulated and asserted by officials, activists, politicians, and historians as fundamental rights of Habsburg citizens. The revolutionary constitutional draft of the Rights of Citizenship in 1848, the imposed Stadion Constitution of 1849, Emperor Franz Josef's proclamation of an authoritarian regime in the 1850s, the Austrian Fundamental Laws of 1867, I'm sure you remember all of these in great detail, and the Hungarian Nationalities Law of 1868. Each of these protected the rights of language use, even if they did it based on very different principles. These guarantees of language use at the level of the village school or the military regiment allowed citizens to make political claims on the state on the basis of their language use, and later on the basis of national identification. This created a range of new possibilities in an age of growing mass politics. There were always new contexts to which these claims could be applied. It would never end. And people at all levels of Austrian society did make claims to the administrative court, charged with righting bureaucratic wrongs, and to the Supreme Court, charged with interpreting the Constitution. That's in the Austrian half. After 1867, these developments were more contentious in the Austrian half of the dual monarchy because there was no national language there. And the Constitution gave speakers of particular languages legal standing as groups or nations, as well as individuals. The Hungarian law also framed language use as a question of rights, but it did so in a way that made legal challenges to the state much more difficult, because it gave those rights to individual speakers in specific situations and not to whole groups. In other words, it didn't recognize nations. Since Hungary's governments considered theirs to be a nation state with an official state language, Hungarian, no other language could be given an equal status. Over the decades, successive Hungarian governments moved away from a liberal understanding of their language law to restrict its application, much to the detriment of their own interests, I would say. Ultimately, in Austria and Hungary, it was not the existence of national communities that created a powerful nationalist politics. Rather, political nationalists used the opportunities provided by imperial institutions to try to create the mass national communities they already claimed to represent. In Austria, differences in language eventually offered a legal basis to propose forms of political autonomy. And in an age of municipal autonomy and mass involvement in politics, nationhood gave politicians an effective tool for mobilizing potential voters of different classes and regions across the empire. Yet another example demonstrates the complex nature of the developing relationships between language-based nationhood and imperial patriotism. Works by Lawrence Cole, Roch Stergar, and Christa Hemmerle examines military conscription and veterans organizations as sites of nationalist pride, but also of imperial patriotism. Cole studied veterans associations in the late 19th century that expressed pride both in their nationhood and in their imperial patriotism. The veterans' determination to name their associations Czech, Italian, German, or Slovene reflected the extent to which popular associations in Imperial Austria became nationalized in the 1880s. The same veterans associations, however, engaged in pro-empire activism in local towns and villages by participating in imperial charities and in ritualized patriotic festival cultures. Neither of these elements of popular identification contradicted the other. Rather, they tended to reinforce each other. Now let me approach the relationship between empire and nationhood from a more institutional perspective. Nationalists fought bitter rhetorical wars against each other on very public stages, a little like today. They disrupted each other in Parliament, a little like today, as Mark Twain memorably observed during a visit to Vienna that coincided with the uproarious Badeni crisis. But nationalists also devoted great efforts to building up their own imperial infrastructures within the larger empire. First in local clubs that dominated municipal politics, and later in mass political parties and economic or cultural institutions like banks or theaters. Nationalists anchored their influence in trans-regional institutional networks in the empire. By 1900, in the Austrian half of the empire, nationalist political parties often controlled appointments to the civil service at both the imperial and crown land levels. By 1910, many, if not most nationalists, were themselves heavily implicated in the successful functioning of imperial institutions. They had little reason to destroy the very structures that gave them such influence. It was for this reason, for example, that when the Czech National Committee took power in Bohemia in October of 1918, it insisted in its first general law that, quote, all previous provincial and imperial laws and regulations remain for the time being in effect, end quote. It's a famous quote. Everyone quotes it. I quote it all the time. But I quote it for a particular purpose. This was not simply an attempt to maintain social order during a very dangerous revolutionary moment, although that was part of it. The law was a tacit admission, I would say, of the degree to which Czech nationalists had already created important networks of political power for themselves within imperial institutions. Czech nationalist politicians viewed the Bohemian administration as their own creation, and they were not going to destroy it, even if the empire had collapsed. As historian Martin Kleczatsky has recently shown, this also explains the surprising number of politicians who served in Viennese imperial ministries and were swiftly hired into high administrative positions in Czechoslovakia. The same could be said for Polish nationalists in Galicia, Slovene nationalists in Carniola, or Croatian nationalists in Zagreb, not to mention Italian nationalists in the littoral region. All had played key roles in Crown land administrations, and some in Vienna as well. In this sense, too, by 1914, nation depended on empire for its institutionalized existence. But if empire gave rise if empire gave shape to rising nationalism, recent scholarship, especially on ethnography, the arts and sciences, and the circulation of knowledge, has shown that ethnic nationalism also shaped the empire's changing self-image in the 19th century. The end of the Holy Roman Empire and Austria's later defeats in Italy and Germany meant that the traditional Habsburg claim to a universal Catholic Roman Empire had vanished. But in the 1870s and 1880s, Austria-Hungary gradually found new forms of self-legitimation in the alleged protection it offered to the diverse cultures within its borders. A range of public figures, including famously Franciszek Palecki in 1848, argued that Austria's existence protected Central Europe's small nations. Later, in the 1850s, some propagandists for empire extolled the ways that Austria was raising the economic level of many disadvantaged regions and nations inside its borders to the south or east. In the 1870s, this kind of imperial legitimation became even more specific, with arguments about a Habsburg civilizational mission to the nations of its own territories in the east and south, and further into the Balkans. The occupation of the Ottoman territories, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in 1878 gave rise to a new wave of imperial self-congratulation for the ways in which Austria-Hungary allegedly modernized, educated, perhaps even civilized the nations of the occupied territories. In their efforts to map, categorize, and administer empire, ethnographers and statisticians, who were often the same people, increasingly viewed language groups in the empire as separate cultures, cultures that even operated at different levels of civilization. All of them needed the protection and progress brought by empire. The empire was no longer imagined to be a composite organization of different historical regions like Bohemia, Croatia, Hungary, or Galicia. Instead, scientists and politicians explained historical or institutional differences between regions as products of different cultures. Gradually, the forms of difference represented by language use or history came to be seen as enormous in size. And this, to me, is astonishing, given the daily ways that people who spoke different languages often shared regional cultures. These claims of cultural difference, although not yet necessarily of civilizational difference, were already on display at the Vienna's World Fair of 1873, for example, and in subsequent regional exhibitions throughout the empire. These claims were also clear in the parliamentary debates that legislated a new university for the East in Czernowitz, Czernowitz, of all places. The university was founded in the poorest of crown lands that suffered from the lowest rates of illiteracy in the Austrian half of the monarchy, Bukovina. Its official teaching language was to be German, although it did have the first chairs in Ukrainian and Romanian language. The symbolic high point, though, of this new vision of the purpose of empire was undoubtedly the so-called Kronprinzenwerk, Österreich-Ungarn in Wort und Bild, Austria-Hungary in word and image. The series of volumes covering both halves of the dual monarchy offered a dynamic example of just how much nation and empire contributed to each other's mutual construction. Volumes detailed flora, fauna, geological formations, but also peoples, their customs, and their material cultures. Many writers who contributed essays were themselves well-known nationalist scholars. In this context, they were nationalists enlisted explicitly to an imperial cause. Another site of a proclaimed civilizational mission I have already mentioned was the administration of Bosnia-Herzegovina. In this complex case, we can see a range of state building, both from below and, of course, from above. On the one hand, from above, the administration of Benjamin von Kalai at the turn of the century sought to modernize Bosnia by planting imperial institutions to foster education and economic reform. The very invasion of Bosnia and Herzegovina, quote, had promoted the cause of humanity and civilization, quote, by sponsoring, quote, a productive peace there, end quote. These words, articulating empire's civilizational mission, were spoken by a Catholic politician, also a Croatian nationalist. Many Serb and Croatian nationalists traveled to Bosnia precisely to help build their own nationalist movements by participating in the imperial mission as civil servants or teachers. The two roles fit surprisingly well together in this situation. Empire and nation continued to define each other, especially in this colonial site. And if empire and nation were intimately related to each other, then we have to ask, to what degree nationalist political conflict in fact weakened the Habsburg state? From the point of view of institutions and organizations, nationalists did dominate public life in most regions of the monarchy, no question about that. Yet their activism and their rhetoric involved public performance and posturing, let's not forget that aspect of politics, to gain political ends. We know far less about the private moments, because that was a time before Facebook and before phones that could record private sessions, when things were arranged among opponents far away from public view. What looks like conflict in public may not always be conflict. Secondly, another point. In 1905, Czech and German nationalist parties and the imperial government negotiated a compromise to divide the province of Moravia into a Czech section and a German section. Moravians, except for the landowning nobility, would register as members of either a Czech or a German nation. From then on, they and their descendants would vote only within a national group, and their children had to attend the school of the nation they had chosen. This was really the first time that any Austrians had to choose a legally fixed nationality for themselves and their children. Before this, language use and nationality had been a voluntary quality, only important when it came to issues of schooling or the census. The compromise confused many Moravians who weren't sure to what group they should belong, or they didn't want to belong to either nation. But the compromise applied precisely to people and not to territory. Moravia could not be divided geographically, since Czech and German speakers lived either interspersed with each other in cities or in population islands. This kind of national autonomy was later also negotiated in two further crown lands, Bukovina and then Galicia. I mention these compromises for two reasons. First, their examples demonstrate the kinds of political decentralization toward which Austrian politics were moving before the First World War. A decentralization that, of course, the military dictatorship tried to reverse during the war, but to which Emperor Charles tried to return in 1917. The second point is more consequential and has been famously argued by Tara Zara, Jeremy King, and Gerald Sturz. The compromise was a victory for nationalists who not only desired separation, but who also wanted the state to define immutable understandings of nationhood that should be evaluated and ascribed by external experts in the future. National identity should not be voluntary, but externally ascribed. This demanded a belief that profound differences separated people. People who, I and others have argued, were in fact rather similar in culture, habits, tastes, and material culture. This development would lead to almost racialized understandings of difference in the interwar period, for which the only solution was removal. In Gerald Sturz's words, this kind of ethnic attribution had well-meaning intentions and terrible outcomes after the First World War. Actually, during the First World War, too. This is all the more unsettling because from another point of view, nationalism does not appear to have been a especially dominant concern among ordinary people. In some situations, of course, such as local elections, nationalist feelings did run high or could run high. But in so many other daily life situations, the opposite was the case. The frequent and admitted failures of nationalists to mobilize local populations successfully led some of us to develop a concept back in the day of indifference to nation as an alternative way to understand how nationalism had functioned in local social life. Indifference, like empire, was never meant to be the opposite of nationhood or nationalism, but rather a way to relativize nationalism's significance in daily life. I've spoken about the relationship between nation and empire, whose legacies flourished at every level of society and governance well after Austria-Hungary disappeared from the map. How might we integrate these histories into those of the successor states? I'm not convinced that it's even possible given today's political climate, but things might change. But I do believe that refocusing our attention on relationships between the local and the state would alter our understanding of empire in national historiographies. When we make national communities and political movements the subjects, the building blocks of history, we risk erasing or trivializing other critical units of analysis, such as the region, the village, the local church, the local choral society, or even the individual. And how can we ascertain just how villagers engaged with state institutions and the opportunities or possibilities that empire created for them? More than that, we risk erasing the unexpected relationships established by people's movement across regions or through commercial or scientific networks, relationships that could stretch across empires and sometimes across continents and oceans. One has only to think of the case of Italian nationalists in the Adriatic in 1848, so beautifully analyzed by Dominique Ryle in her book titled, very appropriately, Nationalists Who Feared the Nation. Here, and I'm not going to do justice to the argument, but here, avowed nationalists like Niccolo Tomaseo doubted the wisdom of detaching Trieste from Austria and giving it to a future Italy, even though they passionately supported anti-Habsburg revolution and participated in it in nearby Venice. Their stories only make sense if we remember empire and the links that connected local Triesters to international commercial networks, leaving aside for a moment our presumptions about their Italian nationalism. Here, empire's logic defies nation's logic, and we cannot treat cases like this as trivial exceptions to a bigger rule. We have to treat them as the rule. For this reason, I believe that both micro and global historical practices can serve us well if we want to grasp the complexity of the relations empire engendered among its peoples. If we place empire at the center of the story, we may also produce histories that are personally more recognizable to a public audience. So many stories inherited by today's Central Europeans contain significant elements of family mobility, family multilingualism, family intermarriage, commercial or labor connections that crisscrossed empire to an astonishing degree. Why not provide them with a recognizable history rather than a history that forces them into more limited national categories? In an age, and I say this as someone at the European University Institute speaking from Florence, that in an age where we struggle to make Europe, rather than its constituent states, meaningful to Europeans, why not construct histories oriented more to linguistic pluralism, to mobility, and to interconnection? Make those things the subject, whether between alpine valleys, between regions, or between Europe and other continents. This, I think, is a reason to remember empire. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you. That was marvelous, fascinating, provocative. Now, I've been asked I've been asked to request of our viewers if they have questions. Please leave the questions in the comments of the live stream, or send them to ICEES at Berkeley.edu. That's ISEEES at Berkeley.edu. But I think perhaps simpler would be to put the questions in the comments in the live stream, and then we will then forward them to Peter. But in the meantime, we have a question from Dominique, who will start us off. Dominique Ryle.
Hi, well, this was so much fun. Peter, I love your mind. And I really appreciated this idea about recognizable history. And I have two questions. The first question is about this idea of why hide the empire? In the histories of the successor states, why is empire gone? And I totally agree with what you're saying about hiding certain continuities, creating the emancipation story. These are myths that maybe you're trying to create a new civic loyalty. They might be also very instrumentalized. But I'm wondering, is there also something about not seeing how the sausage is made? So these are states that are highly beleaguered in their first 10, if not 20, if not entire lives. And they have to do very unpopular things. They have very little money. And by hiding the continuities, you also hide the structures, mechanisms of government, of law, of making all these decisions. So I'm just wondering if, I mean, you can only do so much and you did so much. This isn't a correction. I'm just wondering how much do you think that's also part of it, or is it a part of it, but not really the main thing? And then just to be annoying, I wanted to talk about Hungary just a little, and about this nation and individual distinction that you made, which I think for core Hungary sounds really right. And of course, I'm not a Hungarian historian, but Croatia, Slavonia, and Fiume do have autonomy much earlier than these Austrian examples. And they do have a group national rights system. And they do have it all based on language. And I know that Gabor Egri has written an article, I think it's out, I'm not sure, about thinking about Hungary as empire, not as nation state. And I'm wondering, does it change the story to bring Hungary in the way you've brought in the compromises in the Austrian case? And is it just the wackadoodleness of 1867 that we never know how to put it all together, or is there something deeper in there?
Okay, those are wonderful questions. Thank you, Dominique. And also, I appreciate the questions because you allow me to sort of correct myself a little bit. And first of all, I would say, I would agree with you, and I think with most historians, that these foundational myths are critical. And of course, these states can't do anything else in the first 20 years, really until after the Second World War. And I fully agree with you, they don't have the funds to actually produce the kind of national utopias that they promise. But they have a lot of myths, and people have just been through 4.5 horrendous years of warfare in which the Habsburg administration in the first two and a half years completely lost all legitimacy by instituting a military dictatorship that went against all of its traditions of linguistic pragmatism and equal citizenship. And it, I think, was very easy for people to understand these myths at that moment. The interesting question for me, and of course, no one wants to show that actually you had to hire the whole administration back, as many people in Gabor's project are showing. And it's almost embarrassing what Czechoslovakia did. But on the other hand, the Czechs were so implicated in running the empire. And by the way, a lot of people complained in the early 20s too, that people who got high up jobs shouldn't have. But I think for me, the question is more, why in 2018 do we have to fall back on these same myths? And I think from a vantage point of 100 years, it's easier to argue, using arguments about democracy than about anything else. Because ultimately, democracy is the legitimation of states today. And we could say they are perhaps democracies, but we might not have said that 100 years ago. So as to your second question about Hungary, it's a really good one. And it's not only Gabor, there are other people, Balint Varga, for example, who are trying to reimagine Hungary as an empire, because we've kind of let Hungary off the hook in all of our discussions. And I am guilty of this, as are many of us, we've treated the Austrian half as the Habsburg monarchy rather than Hungary. And we've taken the Hungarian claims to nation statehood as something to simply be believed, and then we move on. If you look at the work of somebody like Ágoston Beretz, for example, who's looking at how questions of Magyarization actually were enacted at the local village level, you actually find out that Hungary does act as an empire in many of the same ways. I mean, I know you found this for Fiume. And I think the Croatia issue is a little different because Croatia had a kind of autonomy based more on the historical crown land kind. But it's pretty clear that at the local level, these policies of nation statehood couldn't be administered, and all kinds of interesting compromises and negotiations had to be made. And that's what I would like to see us look at in Hungary going forward. And I would love to see us talk about Hungary as there are Hungarians who have huge fantasy imaginations about Hungarian roles in the Balkans too.
Thank you. So we now have a question from Owen Johnson, which I'll read, and perhaps you can read as well. Andrea Orzov has studied the importance of publicity campaigns in popularizing and justifying the place of Czechoslovakia. Few successful publicity efforts were made after 1918 on behalf of the Habsburg Empire. Might that help explain the insignificant place of the empire in historical and popular thinking today?
Yes, but I think we have to remember that once it was gone, it was gone. In other words, there were no interest groups in Central Europe who thought in any way that it could be or should be revived. I mean, the best you get is the pan-European movement, which is still around today, although it's a little different today. But even the pan-European movement wants to imagine a kind of federalism in which the new states cooperate with each other and gain the benefits that they had from empire. And if one were going to propagandize for empire, I suppose one would do it in that way, the largest free trade zone in Europe, that kind of thing. And it's good that you bring up Andrea Orzov's work, because I think it shows really well how that myth was established and became a real thing in daily life practice. But no one was going to bring back the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs themselves were banned, and even Charles, who tried to return to Hungary twice, failed, and they wouldn't have allowed him. The Allies would not have allowed it anyway.
There were some pretty good anti-Nazi legitimists in Vienna in the 1930s who wanted them back, but of course you're right.
Yeah, that's right. But they didn't want the empire back as so much as they wanted the Habsburgs. Yeah.
Right. We have a question from Emily Grable, which I'll read. Terrific talk. I love how you're challenging the association of empire, authoritarianism, and nation-state democracy. 20th century historians often think about democracy in terms of equality before the law, political rights, civil rights, mass politics. Thinking about the relationship between these ideas and 19th century language traditions, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about whether specific linguistic traditions led to particular understandings of what these legal norms concepts would look like. In other words, did the language used to enshrine in law people's rights, equality, citizenship within the Habsburg Empire shape the ways post-1918 nationalizing states would interpret those concepts?
Wow, that's an excellent question. And it also, since it's coming from Emily, I'm immediately thinking of Bosnia and the indeterminate citizenship qualities of Bosnian Muslims, but that's not what the question is. Here's my sense of how to answer this is that the language of rights that was adopted by nationalists had a really strong democratic potential within the nation. And that's sort of the problem, that when you look at the rhetoric they use in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, it's a language of victimization that contrasts a kind of unfair anti-democratic victimization to a more utopian vision of a real equality. But real equality can only happen within the nation. And the problem is, of course, how are these nations going to relate to each other? So this isn't the definitive answer to your question, and I think it requires more thinking. But here's something awful, anti-Semites in the German nationalist movement and some in the Czech nationalist movements in the early 20th century are their language is incredibly democratic and sort of apply things universally and get rid of hierarchy and the old regime. But of course, it's for them. So that would be, if I've understood the question correctly, that would be the answer. This is what I hate about Zoom, by the way. We can't like back and forth.
But on the other hand, it was a nice, concise answer, which I like from my perspective. So there's a question now from Jeremy Walton. I would be curious to hear you reflect a bit more about race as a technique of knowledge power in the late Habsburg era and in the successor states. You mentioned briefly that race was crucial to constructing separate nations from among peoples who were otherwise quite similar. This is clear in the interwar period, but to what degree would you consider race a late imperial formation of knowledge in Austria-Hungary that forms a key fulcrum to the post-imperial nation states?
Excellent. It's absolutely present in the late 19th century, and I would actually date it to the 1880s. But beyond that, as I see it, what we would call, well, that they use the term race in a way that's a bit different from ours, but in the end, maybe it's not. Because what you get in the late 19th century is claims for difference. And what nationalists do is they investigate every possible way in which they can claim that their nation is somehow distinct from the others. And what this does, as you point out, is it produces more and more material scientific literature about what those differences are, differences in language, but differences in everything. And it is racialized. So by the time we get to the interwar period, there's a whole science that already exists. And you can look, I mentioned this piece by Matthew Rampley on the World's Fair of 1873, where he says, this is probably the last time where they show different peasant houses and they don't link it to civilizational differences the way they will 10 or 15 years later. But of course, the issues of difference then get caught up with differences of hierarchy. And that is all there for the interwar period to inherit. I also think if you read the Kronprinzenwerk, I mean, it's a real argument for substantial differences where you might think the differences actually aren't that great.
Okay, no, I have to abuse my privileges to pose a question because there are none in the chat box at the moment. But so this was really fascinating for me at a number of levels. But the question I want to pose is the some ways the crucial organizing principle of your work in the talk of empire, right? And connotations of empire, what empire means to differing audiences. In the German ear, Reich, as you know, has a very positive ring to it, right? And it was, as you also know, principle legitimizing idea of the interwar years. Even the Weimar Republic actually called itself a Reich, which you'll know if you're a stamp collector, right? That it continued calling itself a Reich because it couldn't abandon that word. It's been shown that it had, of course, a very mixed career. Was used for anti-democratic purposes in interwar Germany. The word Reich does not have quite that same connotation in the ears of Poles, certainly, of Czechs, I would argue, perhaps Hungarians and others. It's usually thought of as being something foreign. It's thought of that way, whether it was or was not. I mean, it's great, I think, to argue against that. Anyway, so there's that set of issues within Europe, but beyond Europe, you know, students of when you've heard this, I'm sure multiple times, French Empire, British Empire, you know, the idea that one would suggest in retrospect that the British Empire had a positive civilizing mission, where elsewhere, India, et cetera, when this has been made by Neil Ferguson, a number of years ago in the London Review of Books, I think it was 10, 15 years ago, it was thought of as being patronizing, even racist to suggest that. So empire in that, you know, in that situation, although it created an administration, I mean, you could do a comparison, a basic comparison of the way in which the British Empire staffed administration in India, and develop a parallel narrative in some ways with what the Habsburgs were doing in East Central Europe, right? So the question is, so how does your empire differ? I'll just conclude by saying that we've been reading Fred Cooper in seminar recently, and one of his many works on the late days of the French Empire in Africa. And, you know, what's interesting is that African political leaders were very interested in continuing their relation to France, right, as you're no doubt aware. But they did not want to do so with the idea that what was continuing was an empire. The word empire was thought to be too, how shall I say, too much a relation of top to bottom, of powerful to people in need of civilization. In other words, the word empire was a problem, and they were going to call it a union, correct? I mean, and the idea also was of a community. What's the British term? Commonwealth, right? In other words, empire had to go. So even in the Habsburg case, you know, if it hadn't been for World War I, somehow they would have had to evolve into something that was no longer empire. So empire is a problem, Peter. That's just what I'm going to throw that out to you as a series of reflections. And, you know, I think it's very valuable that you're proposing a new way of looking at it, but it is something that's very fraught.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you, John. And every spring semester, I teach a seminar with Lucy Ryle on empire. And the thing we look at all over the world, and the thing we're very careful to do is never define empire, but rather talk about imperial practices. I think okay. For example, my book has been translated into 11 languages so far. And the one problem they always have with the translation is this word empire. Because as you point out, it doesn't mean the same thing. It describes something different in all of these languages. What I'm more concerned about than whether we call it an empire or whether it is an empire, or whether, for example, I claim, as you know in the book, that Romania after World War I is an empire, a bit provocatively. And I think all that shows is that there's no analytic purchase to this term anymore. So I sort of provocatively use it because the term nation state annoys me to no end. But I'm sure that the term empire, and I know, is quite problematic in other ways. But I do think it is necessary to find a way to integrate this pre-1918 history into the post-1918 history. And we don't have to call it empire. Even the Habsburgs, by the way, this is a state that really has no name, right? There's Austria isn't Austria. Austria is the lands and crown lands represented in the Reichsrat. And Hungary, okay, is Hungary. There's an Austria-Hungary. But for Franz Josef, Austria always meant the whole, which was why they could never name the Cisleithanian half Austria. Anyway, I'm doing the usual Habsburg thing where you go down the road and avoid the main question. Whatever we call this state, and really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the empire in the village is the state in the village, and the way in which local people respond to imperial or state institutions to pursue their interests. And what I want to argue is that local people, mid-level people, all kinds of people are implicated in this imperial history. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just is. And I wish that we could find a strategy for all of these national historiographies to see their place in this bigger state, and not to see it as something that had been imposed, but to also see how many parts of their own societies participated in this in both positive and negative ways. But for me, this isn't about so much a moral judgment as rethinking how we look at a history that I think has been really dangerous in the 20th century. And I know from a different perspective, you've argued that too. I don't think the 20th century shows us that the nation state, or the states that call themselves nation states, are a great invention that work out well and bring prosperity to their people. And I also think that I'm arguing from the point of view of a Europe right now that's trying to define itself and to rethink its history in ways that are bigger. Because I think as long as we think here in Europe in national history terms, where we don't know what is the significance of this bigger thing, does it mean anything? The European Union is not going to succeed. So in the hearts and minds of people, so.
Thank you. We have a question from Harsha Ram. That was great. Thank you. From UC Berkeley. I appreciate your desire to move away from the normative historiographical myth of the modern era, namely the emergence of free nation states out of the rubble of empire. If I understand your argument correctly, you are not so much seeking to retrospectively re-legitimize the Habsburg Ancien regime, but rather highlight what empires enable or manage with varying degrees of success, namely the multiple allegiances from the local to the regional and trans-regional available to communities and individual subjects beyond the dynastic or the national. Two questions arise. First, it seems to me that it is not empire that you seek to understand, but the condition of cosmopolitan affiliation that empires permit because they do not fundamentally threaten dynastic rule. Second, actually there's no question mark on that. Second, how generalizable is your model? Like Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire was also a contiguous multi-ethnic polity, but the relationship between the imperial state and the subject populations was far more vexed.
These are very good questions. I think that in my case, empire, I'm using the term empire for something that can be a conglomerate that allows for people to think of their situation and their relationships in many ways at once. Okay, maybe that didn't make any sense. I'll try again. Cosmopolitan affiliation is not exactly the term I would use, because the term cosmopolitan to me has a kind of a sense of somewhat more elite culture, maybe I'm wrong, that's international. And here I'm talking about people who could be in a village in a valley in Tyrol and have a relationship because somebody left that valley and went to another place. And therefore they would think of their world in a slightly different way than just their valley. And it's being part of the empire that made it possible for them to have that mobility. So I might use a different term, but I do agree with you. As to the generalizable, I'm not convinced that this is generalizable. And I think that's the point. The empire that I'd be interested in knowing, because you spend your life studying one, you can't, I mean, this comparative empires thing never works, because you spend your life studying one and then you'd have to spend another lifetime studying another in order to really understand. But I always think the Ottoman Empire is kind of more interesting. It's not similar. And what I've talked about isn't generalizable there, but it's interesting. In some comparable ways. For me, the Russian Empire never is similar, for the simple reason that the relationship between the state and the citizens, and I don't say subjects, I say citizens, and I say that on purpose, is so radically different in Austria-Hungary. And that makes it, we can see developments, we can see on the ground policies that are similar, but in terms of looking at a whole empire, I find it very difficult to compare.
Okay, so Peter, I understand you have to leave in about 15, 16 minutes, right? Or when do they lock you?
Or I get locked into this castle.
Okay, we don't want that to happen. We do have one more question. This may be the last.
Ghost.
Well, we're all sort of locked in these days, aren't we? So I have another question, and if anybody else has another one, perhaps briefly we would have time for one more after this one, but I will read a question from Andrea Orzov. I have two questions based on my current book project to pull the frame globally and temporally. After the Great War and the Mexican Revolution in Peru and Mexico, leaders worked to create a new national public, created through expansive assimilationist Hispanizing state administrations, which functioned as oligarchic democracies, a state employing imperial practices combination familiar to the Habsburgists. One of the ways these states tried to create their new 20th century national publics was through an increasing state sponsorship of high art culture, mainly demonstrating mastery of a traditional European repertoire, but also sponsoring avant-gardes. To the questions, this is the second, I believe, from Andrea as well. To the questions, first, given the prominence of the Austro-Hungarian relationship to high culture in so many Vienna-Budapest 1900 formulations and its centrality in ideas about Habsburg identity, I wonder about its relative absence in discussions of the empire's ability or inability to create political affect with an A. More generally, I wonder whether moving beyond the historiographical dichotomy you had to begin with, ideal type empire versus ideal type democratic nation state, to make a more nuanced argument is helpful for historians in crafting more compelling global and comparative political history, including a more complex European history in the EUI sense you mentioned. Another great question.
Okay, I hope I understood this very complex question or formulation. I'll go for culture. This has actually been, Andrea, for a long time, one of the most confusing and perplexing elements of this history. I mean, I lived through the Vienna 1900 experience, shall we call it. And then there was Budapest 1900. And we've had, you know, Lemberg, Lviv 1900 and Krakow 1900 and all of them, you know, Timișoara 1900. So there's something to it. I absolutely believe. But what I find so fascinating is, and this goes back to Shorsky, of course, that this idea of a cultural flowering that goes beyond sort of traditional high culture to science, the natural sciences, and the social sciences as well, that somehow that doesn't show some kind of political maturity, that it's always contrasted. I mean, and that was Shorsky's argument, which was that, you know, only in such conditions of political alienation could people produce this kind of artistic flowering. I totally disagree with that. But I mean, Shorsky was brilliant, but I disagree with it, in part because I see a lot of civic culture in Austria-Hungary. And I think that, for example, when it comes to music, yes, we can talk about Schoenberg and Mahler, but what's actually interesting is the degree to which these composers and other composers end up having their music performed in small towns across the empire, not simply in the big concert halls of the cities, and how choral groups, for example, in local places will take up a lot of these composers. So I do think that this contradiction has to be brought together somehow. And I'm doing it for you by saying that the political part never made sense. And the other parts do. For example, think of Jan Surman's recent book on university professors and his approach to thinking of this mobile culture of professors throughout the empire, not simply in one or two cities, and students as well. So I guess I don't have an easy answer for you, but I think that the idea was I started with ideal types in order that we might move away from them and to show how they represent things that are not in contradiction to each other. I shouldn't talk for too long. I see there's another question.
No, we're okay. I think we have two more questions I think we can get in, but I have a comment in what you've just said, which is that that culture went far beyond the empire. It went to St. Petersburg and Paris and London and New York and Baltimore, right, of professors. I've studied this. And they usually they gravitate around Paris. So anyway, that was the wonderful thing about the Europe of that period. So now we have a question from Avi Rosenzweig. Can we hear a little more about church-state distancing or the withdrawal of church influence involvement in centralizing governance?
Okay, I could talk all night about that, but I'm not quite sure how you want to relate that to the topic of the lecture, since I didn't really mention it. This may not be what you want to hear, but what I would say is that, as you probably know, there's a powerful culturally driven Catholic revival after 1848 that a lot of historians kind of forget about. We sort of think, oh, the Concordat goes, so there's this church-state separation. But the power of that revival means that politically, the church becomes quite important, not in terms of, say, the Constitution, but in terms of political movements. And then, of course, many nationalist movements, I'm thinking of Slovene nationalism, for example, are linked quite closely to Catholic populist parties and there's good work on this. And what I would like to see is more people pull these regions together, like how does Stoyalovsky relate to Lueger, for example, but that's beyond your question. I think I've said about all I can say, except that the conflict between liberalism and the church becomes the model, in my opinion, for the conflict between nationalist movements.
From Rock Stergar, could you comment briefly on the importance of World War I for nationalization, for the spread of national identifications? Would you agree with those who argue, here I am thinking of Rudolf Kuchera or Jiří Hutečka, for instance, that the kind of negative nationalization that the armed forces pursued during the war had actually been quite instrumental in turning the largely nationally indifferent peasants into Czechs or Slovenes?
Yes and no. And Rock, you're much more the expert on this question than I am. I think absolutely the experience of the utter mistreatment of certain language groups by the military regime, there's no question it created a lot of alienation and delegitimized the imperial regime. But what I want to know is, does it also make people nationalists? In other words, it makes people hate the regime, and nationalism can become a way of mobilizing oneself against the regime. But if we think about when all of that happened, the real hardcore abandonment of the regime, it's the end of 1917, it's 1918, by which time, I mean, it makes me wonder about how powerful the nationalization is. But I completely agree there's an alienation. It's just I'm not sure I can say clearly that alienation produces nationalism. It certainly produces openness to nationalism and national opposition to the regime, absolutely.
From Andrew Demschuk, your book is so excellent in demonstrating the inherent modernism and democracy of the Habsburg state, which was working out as well as, if not better than most other states of the time until the outcome of the First World War. Is there going to be an article-length version of the argument from the book? I so want to assign a shorter work too. The nation state is not the great invention that works out well. It certainly is not an organic inherent thing, something I've always had. I always have to start my teaching with, since students grow up in a world in which nationalism is the given of how humans group themselves in
I'm trying to remember if I've written an article in which all these arguments appear. I'll have to think about that one, and I will let you know in a personal communication. But I will say all of this started because I used to teach a history at Swarthmore of nations and nationalism in Eastern Europe. And I would constantly find myself assigning really interesting pieces by my colleagues. But then for the big story, I would always fall back on the old nationalist tropes. And so So that's why it had, it had to be done. And I understand completely the problem that you face. And I think a lot of my colleagues, I'm thinking of Emily, Dominique, Tara, all have tried to develop interesting strategies for, turning students, making students open to other possibilities.
Now a question from Jason Wittenberg. Do you think Jewish loyalty to the empire played into interwar anti-Semitism?
No, well, what I would say is that anti-Semitism, okay, well, how should I put this? There's a lot of work being done now that shows that actually the Habsburg administrators, particularly at the local level, particularly in Galicia, in the last year and a half, 2 years of the war, were increasingly tolerant of anti-Semitic actions taken against Jewish citizens, and that Jewish citizens in those parts of the empire increasingly could not rely on the Habsburg state in the traditional way that they had. So I would sort of say that Jewish loyalty to the Habsburg state is something that we need to study a little more closely. Because I'm not convinced that at the end it's so powerful. And there's a student of mine, Jan Rybak, who's written a book on this that's going to come out in a year, I hope, from Oxford. And he actually did it. I just read what he wrote. But I would say that, of course, anti-Semitism in the 20s and 30s was, it has a lot of impetuses. One of them, of course, is this idea of the Jews as international, even in a time of Zionism where Jews are trying to say they are a nation, just like all the other nations. But I think that the anti-Semitism of the interwar period is already quite set in its characteristics during the war, if not before. And that maybe isn't the best answer, but.
Well, that was great. That answer, as well as all the other ones, as well as the presentation. And I think we're about out of time now. So I'd like to ask everyone who can hear me to give a round of applause to Pieter, out to Florence. And thank you so much for your generosity, for the fabulous opportunity, as Dominique said, in some ways, to simply engage with you intellectually. It was wonderful. Okay, and
so much.
We bow to you. Wir verbeugen uns. Okay. Anyway, be well, everybody. I'm going to leave now. I think that's about it.
Bye.
Great.
Bye.